So now, because trust transference has grown so old, we are 7 years old, we can now look back at our past, which is always interesting. Those who were here in 2012 might recall that Barry Koch, who was then working at JP Chase, explained how, looking at the credit card data of its clients at the bank, he discovered and then uncovered a network of traffickers in a chain of nail salons in New York. And I thought it was fascinating because if you start to follow the money, then you're sure to find some dodgy things. So I told him we had to take action together and that we should convince all the other banks in the US, because this happened in the US, to do the same as JP Chase. So we decided to create the Bankers Alliance. But of course, if I tried to do that alone, nobody would know me because I was just starting in that field of trafficking. So I went to see Cyrus Vance, who was the Manhattan District Attorney, and I said, I need you to launch this action. Would you be up for the game? And of course he was. So we invited all the biggest banks in the US to come and discuss with us. So of course they all came because they were afraid of Cyrus, not of me. and we started the discussion on how they could incorporate into their software the red flags that Martina Vandenberg and many other NGOs specialized in human trafficking would design to show when there could be a pattern of human trafficking. The slavers use their credit card exactly as much as us. So if you follow the credit card, you could find a few things. So the first Bankers Alliance was launched in 2014. And at that stage, the six biggest banks in the US, among which Bank of America, Citigroup, JP Chase, Barclays, and a few others, plus Western Union, which is important, and FinCEN, which is the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network in the US, adopted these red flags. And soon after, the Manhattan DA reported a significant spike in the number of suspicious activity reports. In 2017, the Banks Alliance was replicated in Europe with a toolkit for financial institutions, which was immediately endorsed by the Wolfberg Group of the 15 biggest banks in the world. A few months ago in New York, we updated all the set of red flags that we had done 4 years ago in order that they are up to date. And now we are doing this in Asia too. So to explain how this first action at Trust Women at the time had long-lasting impact, we have a star panel. We have Martina Vandenberg, who is the founder and president of the Human Trafficking Pro Bono Legal Center in Washington, D.C., as a moderator. And we have on the panel Cyrus Vance Jr., of course, the Manhattan District Attorney, Asif Saleh, who is the #2 of BRAC, which is the biggest NGO in the world, but was also a very big bank, a BRAC bank. We have Eric Barnett, who is the regional head of Europe for financial crime threat mitigation at HSBC, and is a great specialist of the issue. And finally, Neil Giles, who is the director of Stop the Traffic, Center for Intelligence-Led Prevention. If you want to come on stage while we have a quick video.
Modern slavery is one of the world's fastest growing criminal enterprises. Traffickers make an estimated $150 billion a year in illicit profits, but the real figure is likely to be far higher. Their financial transactions leave a trail that can be used to catch them. Financial data provides vital evidence for prosecutors to use in court, but the right data can be tricky to find. To ease the task, in 2014, the Thomson Reuters Foundation set up the Banks Alliance. The initiative put together financial institutions, trafficking experts, and law enforcement agencies to develop tools to detect suspicious activity and allow prosecutors to follow the money. In 2015, the venture expanded to Europe, building on its success in the United States. But can financial institutions do more to hit traffickers in their wallet? And are there other business sectors where collaborative efforts can make a dent into slavery?
So good afternoon. It's thrilling to see such an enormous audience here to discuss this very important issue. And I want to start with one number, which is $150 billion. That's the amount of money that the ILO says is brought out in forced labor every year. And this is a panel that's going to ask the question, where's the money? For those of us who were at the first meeting that Cyrus Vance Jr. called in Manhattan, we remember the very first opening lines. Looking out over a sea of bankers, I said to them, looking at you, all of you bankers, I don't see money, I see data. A lot of data. That $150 billion has to be banked somewhere. I want to give you one example from a recent report from the Financial Action Task Force report that was just published in July 2018. The Italian police managed to identify a labor trafficking ring operating with workers from India and Bangladesh. They brought the workers in with promises of work and legal visas. They charged them enormous recruiting fees. And when they arrived in Italy, they were required to open bank accounts, and they were required to immediately give their bank cards to the traffickers. And in addition, the traffickers set up companies, shell companies, in the victims' names. In all, they managed to launder 2.5 million euro using these tools. And one of the red flags that helped catch activities like this was that all of those ATM transactions, multiple accounts, multiple cards, multiple withdrawals, they all took place at the same time from the same ATM. And those are the kinds of red flags that we're looking for. So I think the fair question to start with today is, now that banks are engaged, does it work? And I think the person poised to speak about that is Cyrus Vance, because Cyrus, I think you actually have cases at the Manhattan DA's office.
We do, Martina, but first I want to thank my colleagues, particularly those from financial institutions who are doing this work. I absolutely believe that the corporate citizenship that's being shown by financial institutions to help end trafficking is a reminder of how important and powerful those institutions are, and how much they, like us, care about ending what is a tragic condition that affects the world. Well, in order to have a successful sex trafficking operation like ours, the Manhattan DA's office, which is a office of about 600 lawyers based in Manhattan, you need to have the right laws, and New York is evolving toward the right laws, but they change from state to state. So first and foremost, you may have lots of help, but without the right laws, you don't have the ability to make cases. You need to have the technology, and Chris and Val, who were talking here earlier today about technology, that's technology that's very valuable to us. Memex, which enables us to do dark web analysis that identifies sex traffickers, identifies ads that can be used to build cases. You need the financing, but you also need the data, which is what you talk about. Sex trafficking cases have evolved significantly over the years. Years back, I think trafficking was really viewed as simply a sex crime. That is more along the line of just simply a sexual assault, as opposed to what it is, which is both a sex crime and a business crime. And so sex trafficking organizations need to be investigated with that in mind. We need to focus on providing services and identifying who the trafficked individual is, as well as doing the business investigation that will enable us to get some of the key proof. And the toolkit that's just come out this summer, 2018, I think is a phenomenal addition to the white paper that came out some years back. But to show you on information that came out from the white paper era, in New York, we don't necessarily have the large-scale international sex trafficking cases that you hear about. Most of our sex trafficking cases, at least those that we've built to date, are around kids. Kids who are coming into New York City because they've been kicked out of their home. There may be drug or alcohol abuse. There may be anger from their parents if they come out to their parents and indicate that they're gay, or they may have their abuses of their own. But it's like a magnet coming to Penn Station. And so we were able, the Port Authority police officer, this is about a year or so back, was able to see that this one trafficker was hitting these kids up as soon as they came out the bus. And we really didn't know how to get into that case. But ultimately, and this is where the banks and the financial institutions come in, ultimately, we were able, with the help of Western Union, and Western Union was one of the early supporters of sharing information from financial services companies. Western Union was able to backtrack and find all the bus tickets that this trafficker had bought kids all around the state of New York. And in that way, we were able to identify the victims. We were able to provide corroborating evidence that can prove the crime. That case is now indicted and is headed to trial. But on top of that, what we are seeing in our office is using SARS. Those are the suspicious activity reports, which are filed by financial institutions when where there's an indication of potential fraud. We are looking at cases involving sex tourism, and we are looking to also make cases which may not be classic sex trafficking cases, but sometimes you just can't prove a trafficking case for lots of reasons, but you might be able to prove another crime like money laundering. We prosecuted a very tricky sex trafficking case several years ago, a father and son who had a very elaborate scheme operating out of Pennsylvania, bringing trafficked women into New York City. You'll find, and some of this people know very, very well in this office, that sometimes the trafficked individuals simply do not identify themselves as trafficked, and they will in fact testify in support of the trafficker. It sounds totally counterintuitive, but I think we all recognize that, like domestic violence, like any number of issues where the relationship has become perverted and this bond is created that is unhelpful, sometimes the trafficked individuals simply can't provide the testimony we need. Therefore, we were able to prosecute them on money laundering. They're doing time in state prison. There's no doubt they were trafficking, but the hurdle to prove the trafficking case beyond a reasonable doubt was simply too great.
And interestingly enough, I think on that sex tourism case where you used bank data, you were able to show transfers to a tourism company, is that right?
Well, I think it's in process, and so it's very much in the investigation stage, but we're, I think, using all the tools that we have, able to see a mountain of data and try to make sense of it to a smaller group of companies that we can then investigate more specifically.
Right. So Eric, I'd like to move to you. At your role at HSBC, you're dealing with these suspicious activity reports. So can you give a little bit more background on the suspicious activity reports and how they work and why they're so secret?
Sure. So let me give a brief anecdote if I could, because I think that may be the best way to explain how a suspicious activity report then becomes actually someone going to jail for instance, something like human trafficking. So a young woman walked into an HSBC branch, and she was closely accompanied by a man, and the man sort of strangely hung around her during the entire time she was in the bank. And this was observed by one of our branch officials who had actually seen her before and noticed that she only deposited large amounts of cash in a cash machine, even though there were open teller windows, which would be faster and more efficient in terms of depositing the money. And the man seemed to supervise the entire procedure. Having learned from law enforcement, so having learned from other cases what sort of indicators might be of human trafficking, she suspected this. And consistent with the training that she'd received from HSBC and law enforcement, she didn't confront the woman, she didn't confront the man, but rather she wrote basically what in essence through investigation became a suspicious activity report. We were able to look at the accounts, we were able to look at some of the typologies that are consistent with human trafficking and file a SAR basically with local officials here in London. A SAR doesn't mean that there's actually criminal activity. What it means is that there's suspicion of criminal activity on behalf of a bank. It's a fairly low standard for us, but it's one that we take extremely seriously in terms of reviewing who our account holders are. And I think we might have some pictures of what that SAR turned into. So these are individuals who were actually arrested by police and sentenced for up to 2 to 5 years in prison here in London. I think there's 2 sets of them, so there might be another one. They're really very, very unattractive and scary-looking people. Ultimately, these are the kinds of people, unfortunately, that I think all of you know better probably even than I, and certainly Cyrus knows very well. These are the types of people that we're dealing with, really depraved human beings who will prey on those. And we're able to find that through our training, working in a public-private partnership with law enforcement. That's the analog version, if I will. The digital version is what we've been talking about, which is then taking our data. And HSBC is a global bank. We're in almost 70 countries. We have the data roughly a quarter the size of Facebook's. So we have a tremendous amount of data. And now what we're doing in a pilot program through my office is actually looking at that data for the typologies that you would have normally observed looking manually through someone's account. So that's the next stage for us now and we've already started to file some SARs. They are secret, so I can't talk about the very specific types of SARs that we're filing. I can only tell you, fortunately, that the law enforcement, through public-private partnerships, work extremely closely with us on the typologies that we should be looking for, and we then provide information to them through our investigations.
So it seems to me that there could be a tsunami of SARs. So how on earth does law enforcement sort through all of these suspicious activity reports?
First of all, I think us in law enforcement have to say thank you to the financial institutions who filed these SARs, because it is a very big responsibility that I don't think people predicted, the volume of SARs that would be filed as well as the costs that would come to the financial institution to do that work. Sometimes the financial institutions, I think when they send SARs in, they think they're like letters to Santa Claus. It's going out, but no one's going to read it. But we do, in fact, pore over the SARs. And we have a financial analyst in our sex trafficking unit of several whose job it is simply to review SARs and to determine if there is enough information to suspect criminal liability. We may be back in touch with the bank again then and try to flesh out what's behind the SAR. So it's a big burden for the banks, but it's turned out, I think, across the board to be ultimately very beneficial to law enforcement.
And one thing that's changed, of course, this year is there's now a new checkbox on the American suspicious activity reports, a checkbox for trafficking and smuggling. I know that there was a heroic effort to replicate what happened with Cyrus Vance's office in the United Kingdom. So, Neil, I want to turn to you. Can you just talk about the role of Stop the Traffic in setting up the European Bankers Alliance and what you have seen as the results?
Okay, a couple of years ago, we worked in close partnership with the Thomson Reuters Foundation and Monique's leadership, and encouraged between us Europol to become a co-sponsor, and effectively began to replicate the work that had been going on in the United States with the European Bankers Alliance. In truth, the majority of the banks that joined that initial foray were from the United Kingdom, albeit global banks in their own right. But banking is cultural. Therefore, the red flags need to be contextual for the cultures they represent. And the result of that, a couple of years ago, was the publication of the European Bankers Alliance Red Flag Manual, one that was welcomed, I think, across the industry, and one that has, I think, it's the first steps of a radical process to try to have the finance sector be a part of prevention of trafficking going forward.
Can I just stop you there, though? It's interesting that you say these have to be sort of culturally specific red flags. So what are some of the specific red flags that the Europeans developed?
Banking is cultural. In the UK, checkbooks are rare. In the United States, that's not necessarily the same. So that's the kind of cultural approach to banking. You walk into a counter in this country, it's different to walking into a counter in New York City. It's reflecting that kind of banking style for the public. And the traffickers are brilliant at fitting into cultural style. They coach themselves carefully so that when they approach the counter or their traffic victim does, to either open an account or to put money in a way that works for the trafficker, they make sure that's choreographed perfectly to slide under the radar. The red flags are designed to help counter staff and others in the banking industry spot when people are sliding under the radar. Best example I have of that, stop the traffic campaigns in vulnerable communities where trafficking is rife. We recently ran a campaign in the east of England, and we did that in partnership with a bank that were very high profile in that area. We sat and trained their counter staff before we ran the campaign. And during the course of the campaign and post that period, we've seen, just as they saw in New York, a threefold increase in suspicious reports coming in from those banks, way outstripping anything that's the average from that bank across the rest of the country. So when you focus attention, you get results.
So one of the things that we've seen is that so many of the red flags have dealt with sex trafficking, and so much of the suspicious activity reporting that's come in has dealt with sex trafficking. So what kind of steps are you taking to make sure that the red flags also cover labor trafficking, which is actually much more prevalent?
So in fact, the campaign I just spoke of was very much focused on trafficking of labour into the agricultural sector in eastern England. It's where we grow most of our fruit and vegetables, in very long polytunnels where you can hide a lot. Right. And these groups of workers were being chaperoned into the banks by people who speak good English, and with a view to ensuring that they got what they needed, a bank account to please satisfy the employers that they were working with, but also had the opportunity to retrieve the bank card so they can take the money afterwards. So this was very much focused on trafficking into forced labor.
Right. So Asif, I want to turn to you because you are now managing an enormously large bank, the Brock Bank in Bangladesh. And so how does, as someone like HSBC working in the field of banking, how does this impact you and the idea that trafficking could be lurking inside the banking system itself?
No, I think as I was listening to this, and the first time I heard about the Bankers Alliance, my first thought was that we can really benefit by being part of these kinds of alliances, because a lot of these red flags and algorithm that we are talking about in identifying red flags, those are non-existent in that part. So if you also focus on source countries, I think there would be a very, very interesting results that you can find out. I'll give you one example that just very recently happened about 3 or 4 weeks ago. One of the branches in a remote part of Bangladesh, there's one customer who came to deposit about $2,500. And while he was depositing, he looked very anxious. And so the branch officer was a bit suspicious, and he overheard some conversations, which led him to bring him on board and ask him a few more questions. And then he reluctantly said that this money he has been forced to deposit to basically rescue his brother from Libya. So the extortionists actually have said that they're their local partner in Bangladesh, and the money had to be deposited, and then he would be released and they would come home. So this led to the branch official involved the head office, and one thing led to another, and then they identified in that same account within the last 2 weeks, a huge amount of money has gone in, and entire, almost 12 people were basically held hostage in Libya, and they were all eventually released, and people got arrested. But unfortunately, because we didn't have the network internationally, it stopped kind of at the national level, right? So I think that's why these kinds of partnership can lead to a much broader sort of investigation and unearthing. So that's one area where, right now what we have in place are very basic anti-money laundering perspectives. You look at activities, if it's more than 20% of what you're supposed to be, then it raises some red flags, but it's not specifically human sort of trafficking related ones. The second example I want to give is more around labor trafficking, how it kind of prevented some exploitative migration. Back in 2012, we did a study with Berkeley University, and we saw that at least 1 out of 3 migrations that were happening, labor migration that were happening, were being failed migration. Because basically they were coming back either being scammed or far worse off after they came back because they were indebted with so much loans or other things. So we then introduced a financial product from BRAC Microfinance that it's a specific migration loan if people had to go out. But at the same time, before giving the migration loan, we would actually do a check of their visa, whether that's actually valid or not. So there was a G2G agreement with Bangladesh and about 13 countries. Then Bangladesh government gave us access to that database, which led us to being able to do those checks from the decentralized offices all around the country. And the product was such that, so only if the visa was valid from this check, and they would get the loan, and they would start paying back after they get their first paycheck. So the idea was that they don't have to sell their assets, they keep their assets, and they actually are not poorer by being abroad. So that actually had led to a huge success in terms of not only prevention of scamming, but at the same time, just in the last 5 years, we have disbursed over close to $50 million worth of credit, and at the same time ensured a lot of these safety checks before they go abroad. So these kinds of little interventions actually in the financial sector can make a big difference.
So that's a very sort of interesting innovation. I think a lot of us are concerned that people have to pay to get a job at all. So no matter where they borrow the money from, the entire system is broken if actually people have to pay a broker or pay a recruiter to even get a job. So the move is, I think, against recruiting fees, but this is a sort of an interim step, at least to keep workers safe in the meantime. Neil, I wanted to go back to you because I know that you were in law enforcement here in the United Kingdom and did a lot of work on anti-money laundering and organized crime. So what lessons have you brought from the intelligence community into the work that you're now doing to set up the Banking Alliance?
I'm hoping this one works, but I'm the only one. So the lessons I've brought with me from law enforcement are that you need to share intelligence effectively if you're going to be successful in building prevention programs. Law enforcement globally has struggled with the concept of prevention. And whilst I'm a great supporter of investigation and prosecution and rescue and rehabilitation, of course, neither of those things are cures of themselves. We've already heard that today. The big win for us is to get prevention working effectively. And the only way we're going to do that, we think, and we have some evidence to support that, is to use what we know to inspire programs in actors that have a disproportionate ability to bear down on the problem. $150 billion, as you've mentioned, is a lot of money, and a lot of that money goes through the banking sector. We need to give them more opportunities, more information to help them see those transactions, most of which are generally too small for them to spot.
And I think that's actually a really important point. Eric, I'd like to go back to you because you've talked a little bit about sort of manual training of tellers and manual training of bank employees, but to what extent is artificial intelligence being used? To what extent are banks now using algorithms to identify systemic problems or patterns within the data sets?
So it's a really very good question, and there is a trend, and HSBC, I think, is just one of a number of banks that have started to go to intelligence-led financial crime risk management, and that's being applied in the human trafficking area now within my office, as I said, as a pilot program. Asif has pointed out the problem with transaction monitoring. Just looking for a certain red flag based on one transaction within millions that go through accounts of large worldwide banks is not an effective way to frankly find financial crime or the underlying predicate offense. In essence, what you have to do is start to look holistically at the customer. Who is the customer dealing with? What transactions is the customer making to potential sites, for instance, that traffic in human beings, either for sexual or labor exploitation? And ultimately, you have to build a model that we understand. If you looked holistically at the client and the customer, what could that possibly look like as someone who's engaged in human trafficking? So that's exactly where artificial intelligence comes in and machine learning comes in as investigators build that model, and the machine learns by clicking on a particular transaction. That transaction obviously has relevance to an investigator from an inculpatory purpose.
So one problem that we've seen is the law of unintended consequences. And I think a good example is after 9/11, there was a list of names of potentially suspicious persons, and people had their bank accounts closed willy-nilly, people who were purely and completely innocent, but who happened to share the name with someone who was on that list put out by the Treasury. So how are banks, and also, Cyrus, how is law enforcement making sure that sort of false positives don't cause harm to people who are voluntarily working in the sex industry, or people who are working as strippers in completely legal industries? How do we prevent harm to that community as we use banks to seek out data on trafficking?
Yep, thank you. I'll take just the financial part. This is why, as Cyrus alluded to, we do spend a lot of money on this. Banks actually worldwide spend about $8.2 billion a year investigating financial crime. And part of that is I have about 300 financial crime investigators, not as large an office as yours, but I have a good number of financial crime investigators that make sure that when we do turn over a SAR, while the suspicion threshold is relatively low, we still want to make sure that it actually is somebody we strongly believe is engaged in financial crime. And then we rely obviously on the law enforcement, but also in a public-private partnership. If we get more information about particular individuals and particular typologies, we can narrow our focus tremendously to really focus on the bad guys as opposed to, as you say, the false positives.
And to answer your question, I think law enforcement may work off tips or information that makes us want to investigate, but it is absolutely essential that we verify who it is we're dealing with and whether there is truth to any allegation that may be associated with that individual. So we have lots of tips that come into us on all sorts of crimes, lots of investigations, but quite honestly, that's tens of thousands. But out of that, we only make a certain number of cases, and it's based upon intelligence gathering. I would say that at the local level, I think what's happening in America, and certainly what happened in our office, and I think it's coextensive with what Monique and all of you have done with Trust, is that law enforcement has really stopped looking at trafficked individuals as prostitutes and looked at them as prostituted men and women who are more than likely the victim of trafficking. So our office, when I started 30 years ago in the office as a young man, the police prosecuted scores of prostituted cases on any given night. Today, we virtually never file a prostitution case. If one comes in, it's immediately looked at as a potential trafficking case. So I think that over time and in partnership, we have really completely rethought our response to this area. Overdue, and I fault myself in the 1980s for not seeing what was before me, but slowly, and I think almost all around the country now, there's been a huge change. And
now there are actually teams of lawyers who are vacating those convictions.
In our
the
office,
historical
yeah.
convictions. So we just have a few moments left, but I actually think that there's tremendous expertise in this room, and there may be a large number of questions. I would repeat Andrea's admonition this morning, please make it a question. But we will turn to the audience now. If you have a question for any of our panelists, please raise your hand and someone will run to you with a large number and also a microphone. As we're waiting for questions from the audience, I just want to go back to Asif. One of the major problems confronting Bangladesh now is the influx of refugees and the Rohingya from Myanmar.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering what you're seeing in terms of trafficking in that community and what the bank is doing to prevent that.
Thank you. Trafficking is rampant in that area. It has become a huge problem because that belt where the refugees have come in historically have been a kind of a crime belt in a sense, with a lot of drug trafficking, human trafficking already taking place. But the challenge is that a lot of these are cashless, right? And Bangladesh's economy still is a hugely unbanked. There's a lot of unbanked population. As a result, it's difficult to track. So when the influx came in from Bragg Bank, what we did was we did a kind of a check of the activities of people who are likely to be traffickers, like the boat drivers and the various leaders in the community and all that. But we didn't find anything unusual activity, so that doesn't mean that anything actually, but it led us to believe that there's a lot of underhanded dealings going on. Even 2 days ago, there was 33 women were stopped by the Coast Guard, all of them were Rohingya women. And so it is a major challenge, and I'll speak about it tomorrow's panel in the morning as well. Thank you.
Yes, Monique, please.
Yes. As nobody else has a question, I have one. I'm always mesmerized by how much money, and the question is to the bankers, by how much money the banks spend to make sure that there is no money and anti-money laundering, and they don't spend as much money for trafficking, which is a much bigger human crimes. So my question maybe is wrong. Maybe it should be to law enforcement and say why law enforcement don't pay as much attention to human trafficking than to money laundering.
I'll let the bank answer that. Monique, I think there is an evolution, and you and the people in this room are very much the reason that evolution is gaining the momentum it has been. I do not think that there is the same awareness. I'm not going to speak about myself personally, but there is not an awareness about sex trafficking in the United States, for example. In fact, I think it is relatively not considered by the majority of the population. So if no one believes it's there or doesn't know it's there, then they are not looking to find out how to identify it and prosecute it. I think that is changing. I think we saw this, as I said earlier, in domestic violence. I think we have a very different attitude toward how to manage domestic violence situations today than we did 35 years ago. It took America 35 years to figure out what to do with seatbelts, that would save lives. And I think trafficking is moving very quickly, but it does not yet have the awareness of that it should have in certain parameters. We spend, Carolina Holderness is here today, she's the head of our trafficking unit and does a phenomenal job. We spend a lot of time in our office on trafficking. So I can say that, but I know you, and I couldn't face you unless we spent a lot of time on trafficking. We could no longer be friends. But so it depends on the office, but we certainly spend what I think is just about the right amount of time making sure that trafficking cases don't slip between the cracks.
And Eric, do you want to also address that about the...
Yeah, I think a lot of it is localized. I think if you look at the National Crime Agency here in London, if you look at their annual crime priorities, human slavery, human trafficking is right up at the top. So therefore, for our regulators, we like to tell them we're in line with the priorities of the local crime agency. So therefore, that's why we're running this pilot program, and that's why we've done training for the tellers and worked with Stop the Traffic, et cetera. So I think a lot of it is localized. I think you'll always see priorities between the law enforcement, the banks, and the regulators probably cycle as we go through.
And I think one point is that Great Britain has a cabinet-level member who is responsible for human trafficking. I think he testified. He resigned?
Yes, 6 months ago.
Well,
and he's still not replaced.
So I think we're about out of time, and we're all hoping that Kevin Highland will be replaced. I thank you, all of you, for working so hard on this issue. This is definitely a crime where we have to follow the money. But one message, one lesson I think I take from this panel is, in the human trafficking world, many of us came to this work because we were concerned about sex trafficking. But I think many of us arrived in this field and realized that labor trafficking is a horrendous and much more prevalent abuse. So there's an anthropologist we work with. She jokes that in human trafficking, you come for the sex and you stay for the labor. So I hope that the banks will stay for the labor. Thank you very much.
thank you, Martina. That was great. Thanks a lot.